afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me. Regulatory affairs. Now, I've had a couple of development scientists in different countries tell me that over the years that regulatory affairs is easy. All you do is just say no to everything. I've also met regulatory affairs professionals that seem to embody that mentality. They think they're doing their job if that they can get in before the regulator has a potential to say no, and say no internally first. To me, regulatory affairs is about educating the regulator so that they are informed enough to be comfortable to say yes. Now, I'm going to do an overview of regulatory affairs as I see it, as a function, and lead into biopharm products considerations, and then finish with local considerations important to building development plans in Asia Pacific. Now, the way that I look at regulatory affairs, I think rule number one is don't lie to the agency. Seems obvious, but it's not as obvious as you might think. A partnership between a regulatory authority and a company is sometimes a difficult dynamic, but to lie destroys any relationship you have for both you as a professional and the company. And let's not forget that government agencies also have a chance to implement criminal or civil penalties for being lied to. Years ago, a colleague of mine did a short-term secondment with the Australian TGA and found herself sitting at the tea table next to several evaluators who were discussing the incompetency of one of her colleagues amongst each other. Now, you have to realise you're dealing with humans, and that if you do something so memorable as to lie, for example, they will remember and you will become known to your regulator and your reputation will be tarnished. Also at a conference, I was once speaking to a senior CMC evaluator who offered that I don't like generic companies. And I asked him why, and he simply said, because they lie to me. Now, again, you're dealing with people. This person is not going to approve your product fast if you have lied to him in the past. Rule number two, it's all about safety, efficacy, and quality. There's a lot of bureaucracy in regulatory affairs, but in the end, regulatory affairs is about educating the company's position to the regulator, that the product has suitable safety, efficacy, and quality. And that's whether you're starting a clinical trial or registering a new drug. People sometimes forget that and worry too much about the local procedures, the language barriers, the inherent bureaucracy, and they start treating regulatory affairs in Asia Pacific as some sort of dark art. If you have enough evidence to get an NDA or an IND approval in the US, then by definition you have enough to get clinical or marketing approval anywhere in the world. It's usually just a matter of when. Every other additional requirement should be reviewed merely as a bureaucratic hurdle, up to and including the typical need for clinical studies in several of the markets. Rule number three, the company is the expert on the drug. A lot of people seem to defer too much to regulatory agencies, I find. If you are the expert in the drug, you or your company's experts know more about it than the regulators. You have to take that as a base position. You need to think about what you need to do to prove the benefit and risk for your product and prove it is acceptable to the evaluator. Sure, they may disagree with you and request that you add another study, perhaps, or add an endpoint, or add an additional check or balance, but that's fine. You're trying to build a partnership here, and partners are allowed to disagree. Treating the regulator as a de facto consultant and asking them, what do I need to do, often leads you into a place where you don't want to be. It's easier to prove a drug safe if you've got a 5-year study in 10,000 patients with a survival endpoint, but no one wants to do that. Regulators have seen many drugs like yours and have reviewed the output of development plans for products that are similar to yours. But unless you have a Me Too product, your product is slightly different and you must be able to convey you know what needs to be done. You want agreement with your proposal, including any deviations from current guidelines, because guidelines are only guidelines. And you can't do that if you don't have a strong position from day one. Every interaction you have with the regulatory agency needs to build upon that credibility so that you do have a credibility and become a known and reliable entity to the regulator. A long time ago, I saw some correspondence on file at a company where the regulator asked why there was no data in children and why there were no plans in the company's proposals. The response from the company was that we are awaiting consensus guidelines to come from a specialist group before they made plans. And the response from the agency was extremely unimpressed with the abdication of sponsor responsibility for their product. You're allowed to disagree with the regulator. There is a school of thought that disagreeing too much can ruin a regulatory relationship. A positive and polite attitude, genuinely working to find what you feel is a real issue behind the evaluator's concerns, professionals can handle that sort of toing and froing. Sure, you need to take into account slightly more deferential cultural aspects that you may find in some markets, but you should always maintain a right to disagree. It is the attitude that I'm right and you're wrong in discussions with a regulator that poisons relationships. I don't recall a regulator ever taking a poisonous view with me. They've disagreed with me a lot and I've disagreed back, but it's never become poisonous. Finally, everyone needs to accept that no may be the right answer. For example, maybe our drug isn't as perfect as we think it is. And also, conversely, regulators need to realise that we may not want to do another phase 3 study just for a small market. Rule number 4, all units of drug product are identical. Whatever the API or drug product manufacturing site is used in the manufacturing process, whatever the manufacturing method, whatever the packaging material, whatever the working cell line, all units are therapeutically identical. If you step away from that, you're in real problem area. Apart from specific batches used in the pivotal clinical studies, every other batch requires a certain leap of faith to believe that it has the same safety and efficacy profile. It is a leap of faith. Validation work confirms a link between the early clinical trial lots and every other lot subsequently supplied. All regulatory arguments are based upon that premise that they are likely to be therapeutically equivalent. The common restriction to a single manufacturing site in Asia is completely at odds with this principle, and I don't get it, but such is life, I'll live with it. Basically, CMC chemists seek to prove that the units are identical by using surrogate markers. CMC tests are surrogates for biostudies, and the biostudies are surrogates for efficacy studies. If you have a nice simple molecule like ranitidine, it's not too hard to make robust arguments of the therapeutic equivalence linking to prior clinical lots. And if you're Glaxo and you've got 30 years of experience of making the molecule, you walk to the table with some credibility. It's important to realise that all arguments are based upon surrogate endpoints. It's much more practical than running out and doing the clinical studies that would be necessary to unequivocally prove therapeutic equivalence. Likewise, it's important to realise that you are making a judgment call here and that you are saying there are no expected changes to the product and there is no risk to subjects or patients in making any proposed change to the product. Finally, it's also important to realise that you're asking the evaluator and the regulatory agency to accept your judgment call that there will be no risk of making a change. If you and your company are an unknown entity, or worse still, have a perceived history of deception or incompetence with the regulator. The regulator is less likely to put his signature on an approval letter in anything but a black and white situation. An established partnership helps in contentious situations. I mention this merely because many regulatory people I've worked with think they are doing validation studies because the guidelines tell them to do so. You're doing it to maintain a bridge of data to phase 3 studies, whether you're an innovator or a generic. Guidelines just tell you what most of those bridges look like. Now that's great for ranitidine, and molecule is simple, but what if it's not a simple molecule? What if instead of 13 carbons it has 6,416? For biological therapeutics, the situation of confirming therapeutic equivalence becomes a lot harder. Minor changes can have substantial effects upon the tertiary structure of the molecule, with subsequent variation of safety and efficacy profiles. Even the simplest of biological molecules can become problematic. I know of a case where there was a sharp spike in anaphylactic hypersensitivity seen with a gelatin plasma volume expander. Gelatin, much smaller than Mabthera. Investigation found that a slight error in the temperature of processing of the gelatin changed the profile of a component or components in the product to cause the excessive hypersensitivity. Once the process was changed back, the adverse event disappeared. This also highlights that pharmacovigilance in biologicals is crucial to ensure that you quickly pick up any nasty surprises. The Chinese and Indian markets have a history of market access for biosimilars, particularly for local manufacturers. Europe has registered a few, with Teva's biosimilar Neupogen GCSF being the first in July 2008, and also now being the first accepted by the US FDA for review.